The Department of Agriculture is urging Vietnam's rice industry to rethink plans to file a World Trade Organization complaint against the Philippines over its impending 60-day rice import ban. Agriculture Secretary Francisco Tu Laurel defended the measure, calling it a protective step to shield local farmers ahead of the wet harvest season. He said that the ban could be extended to 90 days to help stabilize palay prices, which have fallen amid a glut of imported rice. Tu Laurel warns that if tensions with Vietnam...
This guy raised tens of thousands of ducks in his own rice field. No pesticides, no chemical fertilizers, just ducks. And guess what? The rice grows stronger, the ducks get fatter, and he makes more money. It's called the rice duck farming system, and it's not some crazy idea. It's backed by science. While the ducks paddle around, they eat harmful bugs and weeds, stir up the soil, and help the rice roots grow deeper and healthier. Here's the genius part. Ducks work during the day, rest at night. Rice soaks up sunlight during the day and absorbs nutrients at night. It's a perfect cycle. And the best part? It's eco-friendly and profitable. Because no chemicals are used, the rice sells for more. The ducks also sold for meat. One season can double the income. Now even farms in the US, especially in the South with wet fields, are starting to catch on. So who says raising ducks is silly? With the right setup, ducks can basically run half your farm.
Ladies and gentlemen, stop what you read doing and pay attention, because what I am about to tell you is shaking the entire global food system to its core. This isn't just another story about Africa rising. This is a story that has Washington, Wall Street, and the world's biggest agrochemical corporations in a state of absolute panic. Picture this: millions of acres of African rice fields, glistening under the sun, not sprayed with toxic chemicals from billion-dollar Western companies, but alive with thousands upon thousands of ducks. Yes, ducks. Quacking, waddling, working side by side with farmers to do something no chemical company ever wanted to see: eliminate the need for pesticides entirely. It sounds simple. It sounds harmless. But make no mistake, this is an agricultural revolution that is tearing billions of dollars out of Western pockets, rewriting trade forecasts, and proving that Africa doesn't need anyone's permission to feed itself anymore. The U.S. agro industry thought Africa would always be a captive market. For decades, they sold us pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, claiming there was no other way to achieve high yields. They made billions while our farmers went into debt, while our soils were stripped of life, while our harvests became dependent on chemicals we didn't even produce. But right now, African farmers are breaking those chains. They have discovered a system so natural, so brilliant, so efficient, that it is humiliating the chemical giants who once dominated our food production. This is why Washington is furious. This is why corporate lobbyists are in emergency meetings, because what started in just a few small villages has exploded across entire regions. It has become a movement, and it is unstoppable. Do you realize what this means? It means billions of dollars in lost sales for foreign corporations. It means Africa keeping its money, empowering its farmers, feeding its own people without begging for aid or importing expensive chemicals. It means African innovation leading the way, forcing the rest of the world to pay attention. And let's be clear, this isn't just about farming. This is about sovereignty. Every duck released into a rice paddy is another declaration that Africa will not be controlled. It is another nail in the coffin of Western economic dominance over our agriculture. This is not just an African story, this is a global story. The world is watching in disbelief as Africa outsmarts billion-dollar corporations with something as humble as a duck. And the US hates it because it proves what they have always feared: that Africa doesn't need to be saved. Africa can save itself, so stay with me. Over the next few minutes, I will show you how this small, quiet revolution has sent shockwaves through the global economy, wiped billions off Western stock markets, and turned African farmers into global symbols of resistance. This is the story of how a continent armed with nothing but courage, creativity, and a few thousand ducks just dealt one of the biggest blows to US agribusiness in modern history. The world has just witnessed one of the most creative and revolutionary moves in modern agriculture, and it came straight out of Africa, across the continent, from the lush green rice paddies of Mali to the fertile river basins of Nigeria and the plains of Burkina Faso. African farmers have released thousands upon thousands of ducks into their rice fields. At first glance, it might look like a quaint and simple farming trick, something a village elder might do to keep pests away. But when you dig deeper, you realize this is a direct strike against one of the most powerful industries on earth, the American agrochemical corporations that have dominated Africa's pesticide markets for decades. For over half a century, U.S. agrochemical giants controlled how African farmers farmed. They sold pesticides, herbicides, and chemical fertilizers, claiming they were the only way to boost yields and feed the continent. African governments were pressured into signing contracts. African cooperatives were encouraged to depend on imported chemicals. And every year billions of dollars flowed out of Africa to buy products that many farmers didn't even want but were forced to use because of international trade agreements and modernization programs. But here comes the twist: African farmers have figured out a way to completely bypass these costly chemicals. Instead of buying American pesticides, they've turned to nature itself. They have unleashed ducks into their rice paddies. Yes, ducks, and the results have stunned the world. The ducks eat insects, weeds, and larvae that would otherwise destroy the rice crops. They also fertilize the fields naturally as they move around, cutting the need for expensive synthetic fertilizers. The system is completely organic, cost-effective, and most importantly, it is 100% African-owned. The U.S. agrochemical corporations are furious. They see billions in future profits vanishing overnight. The companies that once bragged about their technological superiority are now scrambling to explain to shareholders why their market share is collapsing. Imagine the outrage in corporate boardrooms in St. Louis in New York, and in Chicago, as they watch footage of smiling African farmers wading through lush green fields surrounded by ducks, announcing that they no longer need to buy imported pesticides. This movement started quietly in a small farming cooperative in Senegal. A group of agricultural scientists began experimenting with what is now being called integrated rice duck farming. Inspired by traditional Asian methods, they introduced ducks to their rice paddies to see if they could naturally control pests. The results were astonishing. Crop yields increased by nearly 30%, pesticide costs dropped to zero, and soil fertility improved over time instead of being stripped away by chemicals. Word spread like wildfire across the continent. Within months, governments in Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, Ghana, and even Ethiopia began funding programs to train farmers in this method. Universities started agricultural research projects to refine the technique. Development banks, usually slow to support grassroots solutions, began pouring money into duck rearing programs. Soon, rice paddies across Africa were filled not with the smell of chemicals, but with the sound of quacking ducks, and this sound has become the anthem of Africa's agricultural independence. But this is not just about farming. This is about sovereignty. For too long, Africa's food production was chained to the profit motives of foreign corporations. Every liter of pesticides sold meant more money leaving Africa, more dependency on imported goods, and more vulnerability to global price shocks. Now, with this duck revolution, Africa has found a way to produce more food with fewer inputs and to keep its money circulating within its own economy. American media outlets are already spinning this as a rural novelty or a temporary experiment, but they know the truth: this threatens their entire business model. The pesticide market in Africa is worth billions, and if even half of African rice farmers switch to duck-based pest control, U.S. companies stand to lose a significant portion of their revenue. That is why we are seeing lobbying efforts in Washington to pressure African governments not to abandon modern agriculture. But the genie is out of the bottle, and no amount of lobbying can force African farmers to start buying pesticides again when they have already tasted freedom. There is also a deeper cultural element to this revolution. Ducks are not just tools for pest control. They are a symbol of the return to harmony between people, land, and nature. African farmers are rediscovering methods that work with ecosystems rather than against them. They are proving to the world that modern farming does not have to mean dependency on chemicals and corporations. It can mean innovation, tradition, and independence all rolled into one. And here is where the story becomes even more powerful. African governments are now looking at scaling this beyond rice. Trials are underway to use ducks and other natural pest control animals in maize fields, sorghum fields, and even vegetable farms. The goal is nothing less than an agroecological transformation of the entire continent, a move that would end Africa's role as a captive market for Western agribusiness. The financial implications are massive. If African nations stop importing 10–15 billion worth of pesticides annually, that money stays within the continent, boosting rural incomes, funding schools, and building infrastructure. It creates jobs in duck breeding, local feed production, and farmer training programs. It turns Africa's agricultural sector from a net importer of inputs into a net exporter of solutions. And this is why the United States is worried. This is not just about ducks. It is about Africa breaking free from a century-long agricultural model designed to keep it dependent. It is about farmers realizing they have power, that they do not need to keep pouring money into foreign corporations just to grow food. It is about Africa feeding itself, and when Africa feeds itself, it no longer needs to bow to anyone. The release of these ducks is therefore more than just a farming decision. It is a political statement, a declaration of independence, a warning to anyone who still thinks Africa will remain a passive market for Western products. These ducks are quacking loudly, and their message is simple. Africa is awake, Africa is rising, and Africa is taking control of its destiny. What started as a quiet agricultural experiment in rural Africa has now turned into a continent-wide economic revolution, and Washington is finally beginning to understand the scale of what has happened. In August, a confidential report leaked from a major U.S. agrochemical company warned its shareholders that Africa may no longer be a reliable growth market for pesticide sales. That single sentence sent shockwaves through Wall Street, as hedge funds and institutional investors who had bet billions on Africa's growing dependence on chemical inputs suddenly realized those investments might turn into losses. Stock prices of the biggest pesticide manufacturers dipped overnight, wiping billions off their market value, and it wasn't just investors who panicked. Lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill, demanding that the U.S. Trade Representative apply pressure on African nations to reconsider their shift to integrated rice duck farming. Western media outlets quickly began running editorials warning that Africa's experiment might lead to lower productivity and food insecurity despite overwhelming evidence that yields are actually increasing. This is a familiar tactic. Whenever Africa takes control of its own resources or its own destiny, the West tries to paint it as reckless or dangerous. But this time, the narrative isn't sticking. Why? Because the results are too visible, too undeniable, and too widely celebrated. Video after video has gone viral showing African farmers harvesting record amounts of rice from their paddies, smiling with pride as they point to the ducks that made it possible. Regional television stations are broadcasting stories of villages that used to spend half their cooperative budget on imported pesticides but now use that money to send children to school. Even urban populations are getting involved, with local startups creating mobile apps to connect farmers with duck suppliers, feed producers, and agricultural trainers. The story of the ducks has become a story of African innovation. And this is a nightmare for the U.S. because it proves that Africa doesn't need foreign corporations to modernize. It proves that African farmers are not waiting for charity, for aid packages, or for Western experts to tell them how to farm. They are building their own future, on their own terms. Let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the economic blow becomes crystal clear. In 2022, Africa imported nearly $14 billion worth of pesticides and fertilizers combined. With the rapid adoption of rice duck farming, analysts project that within 3 years that number could drop by 40-50. That is nearly $7 billion annually that will no longer leave the continent, $7 billion that will stay in African hands, circulating in local economies, funding African banks, and empowering African families. This is what scares Washington more than anything. They don't fear ducks. They fear a self-sufficient Africa, an Africa that no longer needs their products, their financing, or their advice. And the ripple effects are spreading beyond agriculture. Universities across Africa are now introducing agroecology programs, training the next generation of scientists to look at farming through an African lens. These graduates won't be waiting for scholarships to foreign universities or for grants from Western corporations. They will be designing African solutions for African problems. This is the beginning of an intellectual revolution that will outlast any single farming season. Some African leaders have even taken this moment to challenge international trade structures. In a recent summit, several heads of state signed a declaration demanding fairer agricultural trade policies and threatening to block imports of certain chemical products entirely if companies attempt to retaliate against African farmers. This is bold, this is new, and it shows that the duck revolution is not just about pest control, it is about power. The U.S., meanwhile, is scrambling for a response. Some officials have suggested offering subsidies to African governments to buy American pesticides at a discount, hoping to lure them back. Others have proposed diplomatic pressure through the World Trade Organization, arguing that African bans on certain chemicals could constitute unfair trade barriers. But these moves are backfiring. Every attempt to pressure African governments is being met with fierce public resistance. Citizens are marching in the streets demanding that their leaders stand firm. Farmers' unions are publishing open letters vowing never to return to chemical dependency. Even within the U.S., not everyone supports the agrochemical lobby's panic. Some American scientists are applauding Africa's move, calling it the most ambitious agroecological experiment in modern history and urging the U.S. to learn from Africa rather than fight against it. For decades, the West portrayed itself as the teacher, and Africa as the student, but now Africa is the teacher, and the world is finally listening. And here's the most poetic part. The ducks themselves have become a symbol of resistance. Across social media, African users are sharing memes, videos, and artwork of ducks wearing crowns, ducks standing on maps of Africa, ducks being cheered by crowds. They have become the feathered face of a movement that is about much more than farming. Now let's bring this home. This is not just a story about agriculture or economics or even geopolitics. This is a story about dignity. For too long, Africa's fields were battlegrounds where foreign companies tested their products, made their profits, and left behind depleted soils and indebted farmers. But no more. By releasing thousands of ducks, African farmers have declared that they will no longer be passive participants in someone else's experiment. They are reclaiming their land, their methods, and their future. This is a message that resonates far beyond the rice paddies. It resonates in the oil fields, in the cobalt mines, in the tech industry, in every sector where Africa has been treated as a source of raw materials but never as an equal partner. It says, we are done being controlled, we are done being dependent, and we are ready to build a future that benefits us first. And so, tonight, as the sun sets over the rice fields and the ducks settle in for the night, Africa stands taller than it has in generations. The quacking in the paddies is not just noise, it is a victory song. A song of farmers who have taken back their power. A song of nations that have taken back their sovereignty. A song of a continent that is finally realizing its destiny. The US may try to push back. Corporations may try to invent new ways to reclaim their market. But they cannot stop this tide. Africa has shown the world that innovation does not have to come from Silicon Valley, that revolutions can be quiet, green, and full of life. They have shown that the path to freedom sometimes begins not with tanks or protests, but with a simple idea and a few thousand ducks. So let the world take note. Africa has started something that cannot be stopped. The rice fields are alive, the harvests are rich, and the future belongs to those who are brave enough to claim it. And so, my brothers and sisters, we find ourselves standing at the end of a story that is only just beginning. What started as a few farmers in a quiet African village releasing ducks into their rice fields has now become a continental movement that is shaking the foundations of global agriculture. The U.S. agrochemical industry, once confident that Africa would always be its playground, now finds itself scrambling, losing billions, losing control, and losing influence with every passing day. These ducks have done more than eat pests. They have eaten away at dependency. They have eaten away at the myth that Africa cannot survive without Western technology or Western permission. They have proven that African solutions can be not just equal but superior to those sold at a premium by multinational corporations. Think about it, every duck quacking in a rice paddy is a living symbol of freedom. Every farmer who chooses nature over imported poison is reclaiming Africa's destiny. And every bag of rice harvested without Western pesticides is a step toward economic independence. This is more than agriculture. This is liberation. Washington can issue threats. Lobbyists can cry in boardrooms. Corporations can watch their stock prices tumble. But they cannot stop this wave, because it is not just a farming technique, it is a philosophy. It is the belief that Africa can solve Africa's problems, that we do not need to be trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency forever. So let this be our message to the world. The age of exploitation is over. Africa is rising, and it is rising on its own terms. Today it is ducks in rice fields. Tomorrow it is farmers in cocoa plantations, miners in gold fields, engineers building their own railways, scientists developing their own technologies. This is only the beginning, and if the US and the West are panicking now, they had better prepare themselves. Because Africa is not slowing down. Africa is accelerating, and nothing, not pesticides, not sanctions, not propaganda will stop this revolution. Let the world hear us clearly. Africa is done being a consumer of other people's solutions. We are now producers, innovators, and protectors of our own future. And if that makes Washington furious, then so be it, because Africa has chosen a new path. And we are never going back.